Eric, I'm so excited to chat with you today. You have a wonderful wealth of experience in operations and leadership. Operations is one of my areas and something that I've developed over the years. So it's always great to learn from others who are setting the standards, the excellent standards for all of us, and finding ways that we can help support our team too. So I want to kick us off with an introduction of you and have you share your background, what brought you on your journey to building your company, and what are some maybe pivotal leadership moments that you want to share with us?
Great. Yeah. Thank you for having me, Rebecca. It's great to be here. And so my name's Eric Williams. I'm the founder of Willity. What I have gone on my journey to get here and tangentially how I support clients in this area of work is over the course of my career, I have had the opportunity to build and grow operations, hiring staff, training, building internal systems, setting up offices, setting up new workplace culture, new organizational systems. And so I've had the fortune to be able to build those things out, work with partners, work with clients on helping build those out as well, and really being able to set the tone both with existing teams and with teams of my own that I've led. And so that really, when I think about why I started Willity, is because so often I see leaders in kind of grow into their positions or not necessarily grow into them and kind of stumble into their positions, being promoted from an individual contributor to a manager, a people manager, getting more and more responsibilities, but the level of support isn't really there. And so, what I find both in the operations hat and the leadership hat is that there's both the systems side of it in terms of what's the recipe that goes in to help a leader make this a reality within that particular team, within that company, within that organization, but also what are those skills that they need to cultivate to actually be able to do this? Because a lot of the time they're being promoted, but their kind of support systems within that company, within that employer, aren't really there. And it's usually someone's potentially first time moving into that type of role, or when you're coming into a new organization, a new job, when you're going laterally or up to a new position, the level of support's not there. And so people are kind of left to their own. And that's really creates kind a tough culture for the team when you have a manager, a leader who's stumbling through and doing the best job that they possibly can, but haven't been equipped with the tools to actually do that well. So that's what I've come to realize and work with many of my clients is those system going through systematically about how do you approach this, how do you build the operations, how do you build the training so that you can kind of systematically get to this outcome. That's really what I love to think about.
I love that, Eric. There are so many thoughts swirling in my head around that too, because I've certainly experienced that in my career and understand what it can feel like when maybe you don't have the training necessarily to manage people. And it can be very different from you being really great at your job and really crushing it in whatever that responsibility is. And then people see your potential. They might not necessarily be equipped themselves to train you to manage people well either, or maybe it's not even managing people. It could be leading another type of project, a higher level project. And so I definitely see that one of my sort of missions as an operations leader, but also with this podcast, is so that we can help folks who maybe don't have access to all the resources and training get that understanding. So, what are some things you mentioned being able to identify certain elements or areas of training for someone, what kind of training they might need? Do you have a framework or a type of approach, methodology to figuring out what that training might be? Or do you maybe see commonalities across all of your clients and the types of training that they need to establish a really strong curriculum?
Yeah. That's an interesting question because yes, I there's a framework that I use and I apply it a couple of different ways. But a lot of the time when I'm working with leaders, I find that they're doing stuff instinctually, and that sort of gets propagated through the subtext of a team or subtext through an organization, but hasn't really been explained or cataloged or operationalized in a way. And so people think that just because someone on my team isn't doing what I tell them to do or what I ask them to do, that there's, what is something's going on, right? There's a breakdown in that communication, but what's going into that breakdown? So the framework that we use is called structured deconstruction, and that really involves systematically kind of taking apart the role, taking apart the workflow of the team, kind of whatever's within that, either that team, that role, that department, and being able to look at it kind of like an engine, taking apart an engine, looking at what each piece does. Does this need to be there? Are you rebuilding an engine to be leaner, more efficient? And be able to understand exactly how it moves through instead of just rebuilding it, having a map to how it's built so that you can very clearly say, this needs to happen this way, and here's where the breakdowns are happening. Because if you don't know, to that example about the work's not getting done or not getting done well, if you don't have a really strong grasp about how the work is moving through that team or that department, it's easy to say there's just a problem and just like take an axe to it and start ripping things apart, taking them apart, where the problem might be a very specific part of the workflow, part of the team. It could be a communication breakdown, not broadly, and so you don't need a broad stroke action to correct it. It could be a very specific area where there's misaligned priorities or misaligned communications. You don't need to have the whole team do, a communication class and take that time away. Not that that's not valuable for other reasons, but you know what I mean? If you don't have that idea of all of the work that's getting done, how it's getting done, having that map about where everything is, it's hard to diagnose the challenges and where things are breaking down. So that's always the first step that I encourage people to do is take apart the work, really build a map of all of the work that needs to be done, because it could be the fault lies with you as a leader, and fault, I mean that there's opportunities to improve and skill up and all that. But the problem could lie with someone on your team specifically. It could be a specific part of the operations of the company or the team. But until you do that, you don't really know where to go in and fix the problem.
I think it's great that you highlight that, Eric, because I've certainly seen and experienced moments where it's not necessarily the system is flawed. It could be one small key aspect that if we don't poke and prod and ask the right kind of questions, we might miss that entirely. And then you go in and you try to overhaul a whole system that doesn't need all that energy and effort. I feel like it takes some good experience, but like you're saying, you have to understand the whole map of the process. And that's where operations can come in. What do you do, however, if you're working with someone who isn't in that position and they don't see how the whole company is operating, or, in other words, maybe they have a much narrow focus and so they don't have that full ownership or context? How do you help someone in that regard? Or are you mostly working with the larger company as a whole?
Yeah, I mainly work with kind of senior and mid-level leaders to kind of think through and it not always with large companies, just folks with a decent amount of understanding either in their department, their team, but individual contributors can do this and think about this from their perspective, because this is also where you get into the opportunities to do the work better. If you're just doing the work as prescribed by the team, there could very well be just lessons learned and things baked into the organizational infrastructure, the organizational culture. That's usually how they appear. If there's not really a guideposts that are explicit, it shows up in company culture. It's the shorthand for how things get done. But that doesn't mean there's not room for improvement. And that's one way where people can really think about their own role and opportunities to improve and optimize that, really get highlighted for advancement and having novel ideas about how to solve it. If you're not in an employer who values problem solving independently, then that's a different question, different problem. But as long as everybody's kind of doing their best effort, their best work, trying to figure out, how do I do this work better? Is there a different way for me to do this? Is there a better way for me to do this? So you can absolutely use this process to just map out what's within your specific scope and where it ties in with other people, because then you might be able to identify those opportunities to grow and streamline the stuff that you're working on too.
I appreciate that, Eric, because you're just making me remember a conversation with some feedback that I shared with a team member about how it's one thing to be a problem identifier and follow processes and procedures, but it's another thing to still follow the processes and procedures and then bring the challenge to attention with a solution or some options for solutions that might make that improvement or help the team move forward. And so it sounds like that's a lot of bit of what you're speaking to as well. And I would hope that as leaders, especially at the higher tiers, we have that understanding of being agile and adaptable and always seeking to improve. But I imagine not everybody is iterative and looking for that. Do you find that folks are a little bit more set in their ways and sharing oh, this is how we've always done it kind of mentality? Or do you feel like people, especially those leaders you're working with, are more open, and that's why they're coming to you.
Yeah, there's definitely when I do organization culture change and change management work, that's absolutely part of the equation, right? If you are trying to change an organization, there's a decent number of people, a large number of people who want to just do things the way that they've always done them. And there's social psychology around all of that, why it happens. It takes less energy, it takes less brain power to just keep doing things the way that they've been done. But that's where you get organizations and teams that are kind of stuck in their ways, where there's, especially nowadays where things are changing so rapidly, you could have a sense of people's resistance to adopting new technologies or new ways of doing work. And the world is changing so fast. It's not anything that I fault people for, because you want, it's safer, it is more predictable when you just do things the way that they've always been done. But when you want to, I guess I don't want to say that you can't stand out other ways just by keeping your head down and doing solid work. Plenty of people get promoted that way, but there's sometimes faster ways or better ways to think about taking ownership. I think is the direction I want to take this comment to, is just that if you want to take ownership over the solution, ownership over your team, not in terms of having to be the leader if you have a team leader or a manager or a director, not taking ownership in terms of taking their job, but just taking a stake in the outcomes of the team and what you're collectively doing. That's why coming with some solution, some sense of the solution, some sense of having diagnosed what's going on, not just the problem, but what could we do about it? Because I'm sure you experienced this too, Rebecca. If someone comes to you with ideas, it's easier to evaluate them. You get a place to start the conversation rather than having an open page saying, we have this problem, what do we do about it? If there's already some ideas on the paper, it gives you a place to start, but also you may not choose any of them. You may end up going forward with something else, but it gives your brain a place to get started.
And to your point too, it gives that person an opportunity to demonstrate that they're willing to be the problem solver, not simply the problem identifier. And there's more collaboration, I find, in that too, and more opportunity to trust each other as well. I've seen that a lot. I've seen it benefit a lot more in the remote setting too, because if you are all isolated in your homes and you don't get to see each other, then it's a great opportunity for folks to be visible in a healthy way. Similar to what you were saying earlier, change is hard for folks. And to your point, I feel like all the change around AI and technology and even just the shifting economy, it can be quite scary for folks. And then to introduce into your company, hey, we're restructuring this, or we're going to identify where our bottlenecks are and where the roadblocks are, that can feel really overwhelming, especially for team members who don't have all of that ownership either. So what you're doing is really helpful and valuable. And I'm curious because I want to pivot a little bit to the process and the steps that you take. I could also see how it might be overwhelming coming into a new company and trying to sort through what might be chaos. It might not be chaos, but it might be a little bit overly complicated. Where do you like to start when you're working with clients and help them navigate through their own map?
Yeah, that's where the mental mapping, I usually end up talking about delegation. It's when I talk about people operating on instinct, people call it instinct, but it's a combination of their upbringing, their background, their education, prior jobs they've worked, experience in that company, other relationships they've had. And so when leaders are making decisions about how something should be done, it turns into an amalgamation of all the kind of data points. If we think about this as data and an algorithm or a formula or something about getting an outcome, the human brain's incredibly complex. And so you're processing a lot of that information in the background. A lot of leaders are operating this in this way, and then they don't understand when other people on their team don't arrive at the same conclusion or don't arrive at the same outcome. So having leaders reflect on how they're making decisions, what information is going into that decision, what is it about that one customer that they chose to do that with, would they apply that solution to a different customer? If not, then why not? Those types of questions are what I help walk clients through, because a lot of the time when they're operating on instinct and when you're in a resource kind of constrained environment and don't have time, and you say, well, the way you get out of this is you need to figure out some of the operations, you need to be able to delegate what's going on. It can be challenging. There's no doubt about that. That's absolutely challenging and a challenging moment to be in if that's you, if you're feeling overwhelmed and overworked and there's a lot on your plate. To be able to do more but that's how you get out of those types of situations, is being able to understand what's going on in your brain, what you're all holding, and being able to systematize it out into the rest of your team. A lot of the times, that's why if you delegate something to someone on your team and you keep finding it coming back to you, and you still have to do, you ask them to do it, it should have taken 10 hours. It comes back to you, it's not good. You need to spend another 5, 10 hours of your own time fixing it. And you could have done it in 5 or 10 hours yourself, right? There's a common refrain I hear from all types of leaders. And so if you haven't spent the time in figuring out what is it about how I was making a decision that I want to replicate to other folks on my team, where do they have the boundaries to think people aren't drones, people aren't just worker bees, they're bringing very valuable skills and perspective to the table. So where do they have that boundary to be able to work within their own skills and expertise? But what is the boundary? Where they have to work within these bounds, they have to do it this particular way. The area where they can improvise is this area. Then you start to scope out projects and scope out responsibilities in a way that allows you to be able to communicate and get that stuff off your plate. So when we talk about mental mapping, that's how I think that's, the prompting questions, the thinking through the process. It's cultivating a different mindset for the leader to be able to reflect on those moments. So I do it with them when I'm working with clients about specific examples. We dissect and take apart different parts of their work and do that specifically, but it's about building a different perspective where they can do that themselves. It's start to build the muscle so that they can start to do it themselves and start to work that into their process and their workflow, because these are things that come out in the millions of different decisions that they make every day. So there's no way that we can take apart all of those decisions, but we take apart the big ones and use it as a model for, how can you start to do this and build this into how you're operating on a day-to-day basis.
That's really helpful, Eric. I'm wondering if you have an example for us too, because I can definitely see how, and I've been in experiences where you don't know how your supervisor, your boss, whomever has broken down their thought process and why the decision is being made or how they came to that. And it can sometimes feel like, well, that's the final decision, and there's no way to come to an better understanding. And so then it makes it really challenging if you're then put in a place to make decisions and you don't know what's expected of you in your decision making too. So I'm curious if there's an example that you could maybe briefly outline and share how those senior leaders then come up with that so that they can then help the team members that are reporting to them too, because I could see how once they have a better grasp on it, then it'll almost trickle down. I would hope maybe it trickles down, and then other people can pick up on that better.
Yeah, yeah. And I think leadership is about active processes that it's one of those things that never, it's not like you do something once and then it just magically fixes everything. It's about building in new practices and new behaviors about how you're interacting, how you're thinking about these different things. And so I'm trying to think of a good example here around this specific delegation example. So I was talking about interacting with clients, and perhaps you have a customer success manager or a client point of contact, and there's context that the manager's holding about a variety of different client relationships and why you may want to do something specific with one of those clients, and that may not be communicated. And so the question then is, if you have an overworked manager, let's say you're in the manager position, you're overworked, you need to free up time in your schedule so your workload is more reasonable. You have people on your team who can hypothetically take on this work, but you need to go through the process of figuring out, what is it about that client relationship that I need to communicate to the team member? What is the other context that I'm holding around that one? That's when I get to those reflection exercises about, I made a decision. This is why I like to do it not like going into a room and talking about things and then going back to work. It's about building in this mindset so that you can do this live. It really works well when you're doing it live, when you're dealing with problems, grappling with problems, but it does add a little bit more time. It means taking that extra few minutes, 5 minutes after you've gone through a project, gone through something for the day, and saying, this is something I actively want to delegate. I haven't yet. I need to figure out how. I need to figure out why. I just got off the phone with this client. We decided to go this way. Why did I make that decision? What was it about that particular client? Would I apply that to a different client, for example? That same solution? And if the answer is no, then why not? And so you can start to build a framework for that employee to be able to make approximately the same decisions, because this is where you want to understand what's within bounds. Not that you can guess the entirety of everything that that employee is going to think about, but you want to define what is kind of within bounds. Like you want to get to at least this level of work, this level of outcome. What is it that we want to replicate? And it's not just about the manager's values, but it's about the accumulation of the employer's kind of collective values, the workplace culture, the experience that people have gleaned from these different things. And so essentially creating a rubric about how to make decisions. And I don't want to make this sound like you have to make a big binder of every, like, if this then this, if this then this. In some cases it's just about values and about how to make a decision. Prioritize this, prioritize this, prioritize this. And if the manager with their potentially longer, breadth of experience and background working with these clients, it's not just putting that on paper once. It's about keeping that with the manager too and saying, I'm going to use this framework and see if it fits. I'm going to use this rubric for a while and see if it fits, if this makes sense, and then I can bring it to my team. So what I find with delegation and managing teams is that there's a decent amount more work that managers can and should do to lead well. It's some of the pre-work to delegating. It's not just saying, hey, can you handle this client from now on, right? There's no download of any information. And then the manager is mad when that employee later messes up that relationship in something that the manager thinks is very obvious that they shouldn't have done, right? But the manager didn't do their work, thinking about it themselves, sitting with it themselves, being able to explain and clearly articulate the boundaries, the framework and all that stuff. So that's probably, I think that's how I would walk through a very specific way about how managers can be better about how they're delegating, how they're communicating, and how they're building leaders with the appropriate amount of context around what they're delegating.
That's a great example, Eric. And I love that. Well, first, I love that you shared values because that's something that I always remind my management team to go back to. If there's no SOP, if you don't know how to make a decision on something, go to the values. And you articulate it very well. It's about the outcome that we're aiming to achieve. And so if we have strong values that indicate what kind of outcome, whether we're serving our clients or making sure that we're collaborative and working well as a team internally, what's that outcome? And the value should be able to help at least guide us. We might still make mistakes, but it's a lot easier to explain why you made the decision if you have that guidepost. And then I also like how you're sharing just, the structure of delegation because unfortunately, there might be a lot of us who have been told, just figure it out, go, you figure it out, you'll be fine. And that's not really delegating. I feel like, at the very least, you need to give people the why behind something to sort of refer back to Simon Sinek and his great, distilling of always start with why. But if you're taking it that step further, you're also still responsible for the task that you're delegating. Would you agree with that in some way?
Yeah, you mean the manager? Like the manager is responsible for their team
Yeah.
executing and getting it done. And there's absolutely space for people on the team to be able to, bring to bear their unique expertise and their experience. And a lot of the time managers don't have, when I build teams, I want people who are better than me at specific areas, but I still need to do my job in scoping out what my vision for the project is, what's in bounds, what's not in bounds, what's the context. I think when we talk about Simon Sinek and why, that's the similar to the concept of, or just the way that I think about it, which is the context around the project, is if you under-explain the context, if you just say do X, Y, Z, when you hit problems, the same thing with values. If you don't have the context, if you don't have the values, you hit a problem in the sequence of do X, Y, Z. If you had a problem, you don't know what to do about it. So then you have to go back. Like work stops, go back, get the question answered. That's also why you have employees asking you 1,000 questions because you haven't set up an equation and a situation where they know what the boundary is to work within, the context, the values, so that they can go make a decision. Where do they have the ability to make decisions on their own and where don't they? Where do they need to come back to you on? So this is what I feel about being a great leader, is being able to give people the boundaries and the context and what they need to do their work well so that they can go off and run with it. Doesn't mean you're not going to get questions, but I think what we're trying to do is empower people on the team with enough information, with enough of the context, with enough of the boundaries so that they can go do what they do best and get the work done, get the project completed, do a really good job at it. And that's what managers' roles are, leaders' roles are, to empower their team to do the work. But we as leaders and managers need to do the work on our end to be able to give our teams what they need.
Absolutely. I think I heard you say earlier too, or mention something about overwhelmed managers, and sometimes we're really exhausted and we're putting in those extra hours, and that's where we need the delegation. Do you have any other tactics or strategies for helping managers who are feeling that overwhelm and feeling and they have to put in that the double amount of time so that they can see a little bit more of that relief, empower their team, but also still stay in that leadership position without giving up the ownership that they have over their work as well?
Yeah. The answer is no. And I'll say why. I'm not saying no to your question. I'm saying no as a concept, saying no to some things, sometimes in the short term. Sometimes it's not about saying no to responsibilities that you are responsible for and have to get done. It's just being critical about what needs to get done immediately, especially when you get overworked and overwhelmed. It's easy for everything to feel like an emergency. And sometimes things just become emergencies. Sometimes just that lack of brain power, when you're feeling burnt out, the idea of needing to do anything but the bare minimum, that's too much, right? So if you're at that point, there's some short-term things to do so that will build towards medium and longer term. Sometimes I like to think about this as a spiral. You can either spiral down, like going into a downward spiral essentially, or going in, how do you build your momentum for a positive upward spiral? So when you're in a downward spiral, that's when you have, work a late night on a deadline. You're tired the next day, but the things you needed to push off for that deadline are still there, and you're working at 50% capacity because you're tired from the day before. Well, that means you don't get everything done that day, and it spills over to the following day. And sometimes that busy day turns into a busy week, turns into a busy month without that recap time to re-energize, to be able to have a lighter load on your schedule. And so it's very real when you think about overwork and overwhelm and how much that impacts your energy, your focus, and that can get you into a downward spiral. And some people solve this by going to another job. That's actually more often than not what happens, is that you spiral out down in your downward spiral of overwork, overwhelm, and then you think a new job is going to solve it for you. And in some ways, it does reset your energy. Maybe you have a few weeks off in between and whatnot, but just being in a new space, you don't have the negative energy association with it. But that's not what we want to do. And so there's a lot of workplaces that's kind of the modus operandi for those workplaces. And a lot of it kind of sneaks in a lot of workplaces when you're not being mindful about building your team, keeping everybody's energy level and focus and attention on the work. And so getting in that upward spiral is a slower process. I think it's similar to how you can get overwhelmed kind of quickly, but also it takes some time for that to build up in your system. You have to find the small wins, start to say no to some things, start to free up your schedule. It might be that you're moving from 60 hours a week to 55 hours a week, and that's the win for a week, right? That's a great win. Saving 5 hours, getting that off your schedule, it's better than still being at 60. But it could mean that 5 hours you need to reinvest in delegating more things off your plate, being mindful about what gets moved, how it's getting moved, what the process is, what the frameworks and rubric is, right? So you suck it up. You spend 60 hours that week when you had extra 5 hours. So, but then the following week, then you can free up that time because of the stuff that you got off your plate. So you have some additional time. Maybe then you only need to work, 55 hours because you need to invest that 5 hours in continuing to systematize the work, find out exactly what else you can eliminate off your schedule, and then you save another 5 hours the following week. It's not always that quick, but sometimes you can do it in leaps and bounds and do 10, 20 hours in a week. But then you need to figure out what's the sustainable model moving forward and building these habits and behaviors in for the long term. So I'd say it's a little bit of the slow and steady, build yourself back into what you need to be to move forward. But it does take that sometimes pushing through a particular week to be able to identify and deconstruct what your schedule is, figure out exactly what you can say no to, what can wait another few weeks, even though it feels urgent. Can this actually wait another week? Can this wait another few weeks or a month or a quarter? And just push it off, make some space for yourself so you can actually be a better leader and empower your team this way.
Eric, a lot of that resonated because I definitely went through a similar kind of journey myself. And it started with realizing I can't work these late nights anymore. It's not sustainable and feeling that burnout and then learning how to delegate and learning how to do that in a way that isn't making the team feel like they're getting a ton of tasks dumped on them for no reason. It needs to be strategic and well thought out. So I like how you described that too. It was definitely a slow spiral up. I've not heard it described that way, but I like that you describe it that way. And I've also mentored a lot of folks who have felt that downward spiral. So I'm glad that you were able to share that so that others who are still experiencing that or might be on the cusp of that can identify it and it just brings to mind something that I recognized a while ago for myself, which is that you can build all the systems for the team and the company, the organization that you want. If you don't have a good system as a leader for yourself, then it can be very easy to, no matter how things are organized, let chaos surround you and overtake you. And then that's where, at least for me personally, I can see where the burnout can take hold. I don't know if you agree with any of that.
Yeah, it harkens back to leaders need to model the behavior they want on their team. And so that means if you expect people to work within the normal hours of work and not work nights, not work weekends, you should also model that behavior and not do that yourself. It's not to say it'll never happen. Even as an expert in this space, I still do it from time to time, but I also, with my team, make sure to call it out and not just have it be a subtext in the conversation or a subtle expectation when there are very real deadlines. So as much as you want to have work-life balance, you have to build it in systematically and be somewhat flexible. I think to those times where there's just going to sometimes is a push week, a push day, a push week, a push month. Those are going to happen. But if you don't have the systems in place to be able to really effectively assess your work and be able to critically evaluate your team and your effectiveness, if you don't have that built in, if it's like a 60-hour week turns into an 80-hour week or a 100-hour week when you have push weeks, right? So that's why I'm saying you need to be operating at a strong baseline and modeling the behavior you want on your team and set yourself up for success when you do have those push weeks and those challenging weeks so you can absorb it. So you're not already starting at, zero empty tank and then needing to push another 10, 20, 30 hours.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, and really good to draw attention to the fact that it really is more of an ebb and flow. At least that's how I think of it when it comes to work and personal life. And we don't necessarily. I personally wouldn't want 50-50 balance. I'd prefer more of the personal life, right? I imagine most of us would to begin with, but that ebb and the flow allows for the flexibility that you're talking about because there might be a time where we have to give a little bit more effort at work, and there might be a time when we need to give more attention to our personal life. And if that, I would hope more leaders would embody that. And as more and more are starting to see the reality of it, I would hope that we would be a little bit more understanding for folks and give them that grace and that flexibility. But to your point, at the same time, we need to model that ourselves. Otherwise, we're expectations. From my experience, that would put a team member in fear that regardless of what you say, you're not demonstrating it. And therefore, that's not the real expectation. And they might be afraid to come to you in times of challenges or if there is that extra effort needed and not sure how to approach it, which then gets back to your decision making, Eric. And it would be really hard for me as a team member to make a decision if I didn't feel the expectations aligned with what was being demonstrated from my leader either.
Straight yourself. And that's why I think one of your earlier questions was around who do I primarily work with? And within organizations, I usually start at the top, near the top, or at kind of the top half of the organization. Sometimes working with teams and managers and department heads, along with CEOs or other executives, because it starts at the top, right? Just because your team has a specific culture, your department might have a specific culture, your company has a specific culture, they all intertwine. Your experience is primarily driven by the kind of team culture. And so that's why even a team leader, any kind of people manager, has an opportunity to manage and set expectations or, model the culture that they want, model the behavior that they are hoping to see on the team, but it starts at the top. So there's, I would say, an opportunity and a limit to what you can do at each level as you go up the organizational chain.
Well, that's a great reminder for all of us. And Eric, you're doing fabulous work. The work is so needed, and hopefully, folks listening can just take and glean from your experience. And I love them to be able to connect with you too. So, how would you like them to find you online so they could work with you, potentially learn more about your company and what you do?
Yeah, the best place is through my website. I have a couple of educational things on there, webinar and whatnot to get started and really thinking about dissecting your work and your operations. So that's at willity.com. And so that's really the best place for people to reach out and connect.
Awesome. Well, we'll have that down below so folks listening can follow the link to Eric's website, take advantage of all those great educational resources, and connect with him. Thank you so much, Eric. I hope you'll come back and be another guest. You're always welcome. I know we've a lot more that we could probably chat about, but this has been an awesome episode. Thank you all to our audience for tuning in to another episode of Bad Bosses, Great Leaders, the podcast.